So in this video, we're going to look at some of the key terms in the study of business, government, and society. Now the first, and perhaps the most obvious, is what is a business? What we would normally call a business is any sort of value-generating activity that provides goods and services designed to satisfy human needs. And I want to emphasize value-generating. This is a course in management, and management includes working in organizations that are profit-generating and non-profit generating. So we have to use terms like a value-generating organization as opposed to a profit-making organization. And so by this definition, a business could be anything like your favorite Standard & Poor's 500 company, Walmart, Costco, GE, whichever one you want to talk about. But it could also include non-profit enterprises. For example, a variety of health plans are value-generating but not profit-generating. But we would still call these types of businesses. Our second is a government. Okay. And a government is basically a series of structures and processes that make laws, rules, and policies in an authoritative manner. In a sense, they are the ones that set the rules of the game that members of business and society must follow. Of course, when you're not sure about a good example of a government, think, quite frankly, almost every country has a government, of course. But we can also look at governments in terms of state, city, or county as well. Then we have society. And a society is this kind of network of relationships between people, ideas, institutions, and material things. Okay? So it basically looks at how people interact with kind of their core values, with how they interact with institutions, and then with the physical objects in their environment. And of course, we are all members of multiple societies. We can say that we are members of our family, as an example of society. We can also say that we're members of certain religious groups or church organizations or certain leisure activities, for example, like a sports team. Now our next one is idea. Also known as a form. Now, an idea is basically an abstraction of moral, mathematical, or logical thought. Those of you that have a philosophy background would also know these as forms if you've read Plato, like Plato's theory of forms, or if you're a student of Alfred North Whitehead, you might call these eternal objects. Different fields of study have different terms for the exact same thing. So that's kind of a recurring theme that you'll notice throughout this course. As we cherry pick from different disciplines, we might use different vocabulary terms to mean the same thing, but don't worry, I'll make sure I provide sufficient clarification as we go. So an idea, as I mentioned, an abstraction of mathematical, moral, or logical thought. Let me give an example. How about a perfect circle, for those of you with a math background? Well, we all kind of know what a perfect circle is. We would recognize one when we saw one, yet none of us has ever drawn one, and none of us ever will, because by the time you've drawn that perfect circle, it's already imperfected because of the fact that a person drew it. If you're a fan of cosmology or these kinds of disciplines, you might say this is like the dark matter in the universe. We know it's there, but we don't know what it is exactly, but we can kind of sense that it's there because of the fact that it impacts us. Alternatively, another example of an idea. Imagine that you have a friend who is blind, and you need to explain to your friend the color red. Now, a blind person would have no concept of what red would be. They'd have nothing to compare it to. So what you might talk about to your friend would be the way the color red makes you feel, or what the color red stands for, or what the color red means to you. Okay? So this is kind of another example of an idea, the color red to a blind person. You never really understand what it is fully, but you know it's there, and you can kind of sense it indirectly or understand it indirectly. Now, a slightly more specific version of an idea is what we would call a value. Okay. A value is what we might say, it's like a belief, a long-standing belief about which choices in life are fundamentally correct. Good examples of value, of course, many of you are working that see this video. So you might think about your organization where you work. Probably has some sort of organizational values. Think of like integrity, honesty, courage. You might think of those motivational posters that were such a big deal during the 1990s. You know, to show like a droplet of water, and that would say perseverance, and somehow you're persevering like a drop of water. And you know, most of you would probably snicker and say, well, how am I supposed to persevere like a drop of water? And that brings up one of the key points of what is a value. Let me use a quality like good. Well, we all kind of understand what good is because of a certain feeling that's associated with it. But if I were to ask a variety of people what is good, someone might say, well, you know, good is a nice glass of wine after a hard day at work. And someone else might say it's playing with fluffy kittens on a cold winter day. You know, there's an infinite number of definitions. Or those of you that are fans of the movie Conan the Barbarian, you know, there's a famous scene where one of the barbarian lords asks all the other men at the table, you know, what is best in life? And they have kind of different interpretations, and one says, you know, riding on the steps with the wind blowing through your hair and falcons at your wrist. And barbarian leader doesn't like that example, so he asks Conan, you know, what is best in life? And Conan says to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentations of their women. For Conan, that was an example of which kinds of fundamental choices are correct. Those were his values. Now, they're maybe very different than the values that you embrace, and that highlights one of the biggest problems, and that's why we actually have to study ethics to begin with. The trick is trying to find certain kinds of values that everybody can agree on, when by nature we probably all disagree on these kind of fundamental choices. So again, a value is this kind of long-lasting belief about which fundamental choices are correct. Then we have an ideology. And an ideology is kind of like a bundle of values that informs a particular view of the world. So think of, for example, in your corporation, the series of values that you probably embrace. You know, it could be something like honesty, integrity, and punctuality. So, you know, I interpret honesty, integrity, and punctuality as showing up on time, not stamping someone else's time card. You know, these kinds of individual values, it's the network of how these values work together, and that's how you form an ideology. So that kind of forms your worldview. Now, we can use this term worldview very loosely. We can interpret worldview as something that all humanity can agree on, or we can interpret worldview as how you see things within your family or within your business. Okay, these are all kind of like little micro worlds, each and unto themselves. Now, our next one is an institution. And an institution is a formal pattern of relationships that links people to get together in their pursuit of a common goal. It's what we would call an institution. Now, in our next video, we will look and give specific examples of all the variety of institutions that exist and how those specific institutions are designed to promote a marketplace. Then our next one is material things, or material objects. And material objects are basically anything in the world that we can touch. And material objects are important because they influence our behavior. I mean, it can be something as minor as the fact that material objects can control us. Think about when you look at a door and it says pull. Even though you might want to push, you still have to pull because that's the way the door is constructed. Other things like material objects could be, for example, what Durkheim calls a sacred object. A sacred object is something that is an object that can be interpreted in one way, but we have removed it from ordinary use and use it to signify something. Think about a cross. A cross can be made out of wood or metal or whatever it's made out of. And of course, you know, if it's wood, you could burn it, or if it's gold, you could melt it, or if it's steel, you could use it as a hammer. But we don't use a cross for those things. We remove it from the ordinary use and we use it to signify Christianity typically. Another example of how material objects, again, are impacted by society is determined based on our changing uses of given objects. A great example for me, I wanted to buy an iPod in the worst way, but they didn't have iPods where I was living, and so what I wound up doing is buying a Zune. A Zune was a Microsoft's answer to the iPod. And Zune was really cool, had really cool features, it was great. You know, you had like a kind of like a Zune store, kind of like the App Store, where you could download songs and different things like that, and you get unlimited music every month, and really cool features. But then Microsoft pulled support for the Zune. And so now my Zune is only good for being used as a paperweight or, you know, maybe a hammer or something like that, but it's not really useful as a device for listening to music. Okay, so as a material object, the Zune, for me, has changed fundamentally. The next term is what we call a model. Now, actually, let me compare these two terms while I'm down here. Model and ontology mean almost the same thing. In fact, they are interchangeable terms. You'll hear me refer to models or ontologies, but they both mean fundamentally the same thing. If you're looking at it from maybe more of a business perspective, we might call these models. If you're looking at it from more of a philosophy perspective, we might call this an ontology. Either way, a model or ontology is basically the study of reality. It is our fundamental view of the world. Now, in the next few videos, we will look at 4 different models from business, and they are what we call rational choice models. A rational choice model basically means that there must be a business, government, and society, and those relationships between businesses, governments, and society are determined by rational choice. In other words, business, government, and society interact almost exclusively through what we call reward-based calculations. So, for example, if we want to talk about reward-based calculations, if you're at work and your boss says, if you do this, I'll give you a raise, and you do what your boss says because you want the raise, you want the money, which is a reward. Alternatively, your boss can say, hey, do this or you're fired, and that's a threat. So you do what the boss says because you do not wish to lose your job, so it's threat. So this is an example of rational choice. Now, ontologies, at least the 4 that I will present to you here, are not dependent on the existence of a business, government, and or society. They can describe the solar system, they can describe God, they can describe all sorts of things that don't necessarily have to do with business, government, society, but they're actually really interesting when you do apply them to business, government, society. Furthermore, there are times when business, government, and society are not all that germane. Think of nomadic tribes, for example. Well, they probably had society and business and government probably merged in some way. So one of these normative choice ontologies would be more relevant. And normative choice would mean that you are looking at the world through what you should do or what is the right thing to do. See, that's a very different kind of reasoning between do this because you want money or do this because you're going to get fired. So this is normative choice. A great example that I give to my students is, imagine that a police officer says, "Hey, don't do that." Well, you'd probably stop what you're doing because of the fact that a police officer could arrest you or some sort of a threat. Compare that to if a priest says, "Hey, don't do that." Well, you might stop because you respect the priest and what that priest stands for. So that's normative choice in action. Don't worry, over the next several videos, this will become abundantly clear if it's not already. And our next three, I'm just kind of writing them all up here. And we'll start with unlucky number 13, an anecdote. Well, an anecdote is a single data point. It is one person's individual story, and it is usually something that is emotionally laden. Okay? We can't necessarily generalize from anecdotes, but we can certainly feel an emotional connection via anecdotes. So think about, for example, when you watch TV and it says, a child is starving and pick your favorite country, and you too could save that child's life. Well, obviously when you donate, you're not donating specifically for that one child that you see on TV. You're donating because of an emotional connection you feel with that child who is hungry. The same thing when you look at the news. When they ask what happened during the fire, they usually pick one person. That person says, well, the building was burning and we were going crazy and all this kind of stuff. And so when you see that, you feel a connection with that person. That is an anecdote. Now, when you start taking those individual data points from anecdotes and you start kind of grouping them together, you start having things like averages and standard deviations and normal distributions and things like that. And that's what we call empirical data. Okay? So kind of that agglomeration of individual data points. And then we have the theory. And a theory is, I like to think about it as a stereotype. It is a generalization that we make about our empirical data. Now, theories can be tested. They are right or wrong. You have a theory, and then you can hypothesize based on that theory. You collect your empirical data, and then you determine whether that theory was correct or not. A great example from personal experience. When I was in graduate school, there was this guy I worked with. He was from Italy. He was a brilliant statistician. And he wanted to all of a sudden pick up learning English. And I didn't quite understand why. He was so good at math. He'd always find somebody he could work with because his math was so good. And he decided he was learning English. We worked on it for a couple months. And I said, well, why did you want to learn English anyhow? I don't understand. He said, oh, he wanted to go to Carnival in Brazil, and he wanted to make sure he could talk to the locals there. And I said, well, in Brazil, they speak Portuguese predominantly. They may learn English, but that's not the language of Brazil. And he didn't believe me, so we looked around the internet and gathered a little bit of empirical data, and he realized that his theory about which language is spoken in Brazil was wrong. Okay. So again, a theory is kind of like a stereotype. Now, we think of stereotypes typically in pop culture as something negative, but they are important. It helps you understand a huge swath of data very briefly and very quickly so that you can make some sort of a decision. That's why they are important. If you want to know which language people speak in America, well, you might make some sort of a theorization and say, well, English is predominantly the language of the United States. But you can go many places in America where English is not spoken very well or very poorly spoken. You have made some sort of a stereotype about the language that people speak in the United States. But in some ways that can be preferable to trying to figure out every single individual anecdote. Now, I said that theories can be proven or they can be tested, so a theory is right or wrong. That stands in stark contrast to models and ontologies. Ontologies are not testable, and they are not inherently right or wrong by definition. So let me give an example. If someone tells you that they believe in God, there's no real way that you can tell them that they are right or wrong. Beliefs, or religious beliefs, are ontological in nature. I have no way of telling you you're wrong, and I have no way of proving that I'm right either. So you just believe it, and I have to go with that. Now, what is interesting is the way models and ontologies and or theories work together. Typically, a theory is designed to support an underlying ontology. Now, your particular theory can be proven wrong, but the ontological supposition behind that theory cannot. Let me give an example. Let's say you meet somebody who is extremely religious, okay? Religious beliefs are ontological in nature. And you ask that religious person, well, is it going to rain on March 12th? And that religious person could say, well, I think that it is going to rain on March 12th because that's what God wants to happen. So we're talking about all of March 12ths, okay, or this, all the March 12ths, and it's going to rain because that's what God wants. Well, when March 12th comes and it does not rain, then that person can simply say, well, that's because God did not want it to rain that day. So they admit that their particular theorization was wrong, but the ontological supposition behind it was not. It was that God controls the weather, even though my interpretation of what God wanted that day of March 12th is wrong. Compare that to an atheist. If you said, well, is it going to rain or not? And they could say, well, I don't know, but let's look at the past 100 years every March 12th, and therefore I can conclude that, there's a 60% chance of rain on March 12th. And of course, if it does not rain on March 12th, they can say, well, that's because it was the other 40% of the time. But of course, they don't start talking about God wanting, or none of that has anything to do with the atheist argument. So ontologies and models work well together. Theories support the ontology. Okay. So great. We've gone over some key vocabulary terms essential for the study of business, government, society. I hope you have understood these. If you have any questions, you can ask them down in the comments section of this video, and of course I'll respond to them. And again, understanding these key vocabulary terms is imperative for understanding everything else that follows in this course. On our next video, we will define the various institutions that support markets and explore how they actually support the markets themselves. Looking forward to seeing you then.